Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you very much to everybody for joining this presentation today in such interesting circumstances. Very importantly, a big congratulations to the organisers who, in challenging circumstances, have really put together a terrific agenda and a terrific way of bringing this information, these details to everybody out there, whether in government, whether in industry, whether at any point of the food, beverage and agricultural supply chain, to make the most of what we can this year. And also, importantly, a big congratulations to all of you, everybody watching where you are, taking this in, interacting with these presentations and with the question and answer forums as part of this as well. The things that we work with at this time, and who knows how long we'll work with them going forward, to make sure that our industry, the one we're all here for, agriculture and the agricultural supply chain, continues not just to survive, but to grow and to improve through what's happening around us at the moment. It's interesting just to reflect, looking back on when we started to put together this conference, those of us who are presenters and speakers with the organisers around the start of this year. And when we looked at what the topics would be, and then what we looked at what the issues would be. And with this one, for example, looking to agriculture 2021 and beyond, what could be learnt, some of the lessons, areas that agriculture could improve on and build on and continue to grow, and then wonder what's changed in the COVID period, but fundamentally what stayed the same. And if we look at some of the issues which may have adjusted slightly, a lot of them are much the same. Top of the agenda would be resilience, and how do stakeholders in agriculture continue to build the resilience of agricultural supply chains, agricultural companies, to enhance food security, to enhance food certainty, to enhance profitability, to enhance sustainability, and continue to build this fundamental industry going forward. Yes, there have been some changes, but these issues still remain absolute top issues, and we need to look at how these have been impacted and what happens going forward. It's interesting when we look at agriculture at the moment to, in a way, quote from something The Economist magazine put very well very recently. And that was to say that in the whole COVID-19 global situation, and I quote, "The unsung star of 21st century logistics is the global food system. It accounts for 10% of the world's GDP. It employs around 1.5 billion people. It has tripled the supply of food since 1970 as the population has doubled, and it has continued to be resilient, and it has continued to function relatively well, perhaps better than many expected globally throughout this whole situation and going forward." So what we wanted to look at today was to have an examination of some of the issues which have occurred within the food, beverage and agri supply chain, particularly agribusiness, over the past few months of 2020, and what can be learnt. What are some of the fundamental things which form the vision going forward, the building blocks going forward, and the benefits for the industry going forward as well, as we look towards 2021. So let's start by having a look back at what have been some of the impacts and some of the things we've seen over the past few months. What has the world learnt from this situation, which has shown itself this year and will only go to improve some of the issues, the circumstances, the running of agriculture going forward? What's been really interesting for a lot of us in this industry, and a lot of us who've been part of this industry for many years, is absolutely the positive, some of the things that didn't happen in this crisis, which happened in the past. If we look back over previous black swan events, previous major disruptions in the past, so to speak, we've seen previous crises have seen a spike, a volatility in agricultural prices. What this chart in front of you on the slide shows is the FAO price index, whether the meat price index, the dairy price index, cereals, and the overall food price index. And we see particular spikes and jumps in volatility, whether between April 2006 to 2008, through the global financial crisis, through the Asian financial crisis, through perhaps the period of time where ethanol, the introduction of ethanol legislation led to a lot of volatility within a number of commodity markets as well. A lot of observers, many of us, predicted this would be the same this time, that we would see volatility, rising prices, major food security issues. And the terrific thing was, largely in the COVID period, this simply didn't happen. So what has the world learned, and why was it different this time? A few things. Perhaps the world, whether it be government, whether it be companies in the agribusiness sector and across the supply chain, and importantly, whether it be the markets, have learned that at a period of time such as this, if we look to other issues such as high stock-to-use ratios for a number of grains as well, there is no need for prices to go up. And this perhaps was a dampener. Perhaps governments have also learned that a number of, dare we say, trade tactics which have been used in the past, or trade dynamics, whether trade bans, export bans, new taxes as well, can be counterproductive. Won't necessarily help domestic producers in a particular country, won't necessarily help those farmers, as I mentioned, won't necessarily help consumers, and in many ways trade as much as possible should be allowed to continue normally. And that's something we saw particularly this time and has been a lesson going forward. Part of this, looking towards 2021 and beyond, is if similar events happen in future, are we likely, and it seems the case, to see agricultural trade continue far more smoothly than we would have seen in the past? We can look at it from another angle as well, and if we can compare agriculture, as you see on the slide in front of you as the red line, and its volatility in crises in the past and now compared to other commodities, particularly hard commodities. And what is intriguing is to see that agriculture has increasingly at this period in time, as it did in the past, but even more so now, been a far less volatile and therefore more reliable commodity through these crises. Countries, governments, companies are increasingly trusting supply chains, are increasingly utilizing technology, are increasingly making the most of information to know what their supplies are, what their availability is, what their trade relationships are like, therefore reducing that volatility. This is something that can be built on, but something important going forward. So that's one way of looking at it. One other way, before we look towards the visions as well, is to see what's been the impact of some of the commodity prices at this point and what can be learned from that. And what we looked at here was to take a number of agricultural commodities and some of their major indicators and see how they had responded through this period and what could be learned from this, as I've said before, for companies in the sector and for governments forward. It is interesting to see that a number of the outliers, the commodities that have seen the most volatility, haven't been the stable grains and oilseeds. It's been sugar, for example, which has seen a lot of volatility, but that's outside of COVID. Why have we seen sugar really ratchet up at the start of the year, go down within the peak of COVID and go up again, particularly due to oil prices? And when oil prices went down, sugar was not utilized in ethanol. More sugar came onto the world market, pushing prices down. Another very volatile commodity that we've seen over this period has been milk as well. And you can see from the blue line that in the midst of COVID, milk, and this is a US milk indicator, was particularly impacted by the closure of school meals, the closure of restaurants as well, not being utilized there, but has headed upwards starkly again, largely due to the fact that the economy is opening up again, people are utilizing more milk, and production at the other end has gone down. The biggest outlier on this chart perhaps is rice, and we can see that rice is now approaching 140% of its price at the start of the year. Always it is interesting to see, and it will always be the case going forward, that rice, the staple in developing markets, is likely to be the first commodity hoarded. It's likely to be the first commodity that countries will instinctively put export bans on. But one could argue that with a greater utilization of technology and information going forward, should a similar circumstance happen again, we are probably unlikely, given high rice supplies and high rice storage, to see this kind of reaction in future similar crises. We look aside from that, and whether we're looking towards soybeans, whether we're looking towards corn, whether we're looking towards barley as well, what's been interesting in this particular situation and what perhaps differentiates this situation from those in the past is that understanding by the market of the fact that the size of crops which are about to come online, the size of stocks to use ratios, the solidity of trade routes, the solidity of availability of supply outside certain export bans. If anything, even this volatility is something we're likely to see less of going forward. And finally, before we look towards the issues of the vision going forward, what's one other thing that we are likely to see governments do and governments reacting with and companies reacting with in future? And that's interesting to look at in terms of the products which countries rely on most for imports and those which may see tactically companies and countries diversifying their points of import and diversifying and growing their domestic production. What we see here, and it's interesting, is products which, in terms of their world imports, have the greatest percentage consumption. Coffee sits at the top of this, not necessarily a staple, but particularly a product which is seen more as discretionary. Unlikely to see any changes there. But in terms of the major products, whether it be soybeans, whether it be barley, whether it be canola and other similar products, we are likely to see governments having policies further forward where they will look to reduce their concentration risk, where they will look to build their domestic storages, where they will look to solidify some of the technology around market access as well. And it is incumbent upon all of us who are stakeholders in the supply chain to work with government and to maximize the opportunities and overcome the challenges that we may have out of some of these changes going forward. So those are some of the things that we've seen looking back. What are some of the impacts that we'll see further down the supply chain and then parts of the vision going forward? In a nutshell, everything we do in agriculture finishes and is ultimately dependent on the consumer, the person who buys from the supermarket, the person who buys from the restaurant, the person who buys from the cafe as well. What have we seen and what have been some of the impacts over the COVID period with this? Certainly, as we saw with the US milk price, for example, and as we've seen with meat prices, and where meat prices impact grain through feed as well, we have seen that reduction in consumption. We have seen some of those reductions in terms of labor reduction in these areas, reducing consumer demand. But the supply chain has been very good and very quick to reallocate products away from restaurants into supermarkets, away from QSRs into supermarkets as well, into butcher shops, into other areas for the consumer to change their behaviour. What are we likely to see going forward with this that will impact agriculture? In a time of a reduced economy and reduced spending power, it's likely we'll see more people going to quick service restaurants, the McDonald's and others of this world. What does that therefore mean for those of us in supply chain? As high-end restaurants come back online, as food courts come back online, how do we tailor our products to fit into this? And whether we're providing feed at one end of the supply chain, whether we're providing milk, whether we're providing dairy, how adaptable are we to this? And how much are we reading how much the consumer may change in what they spend now, what they'll be spending in 6 months when it's likely there'll be a recessionary impact on a lot of the world, and what they'll be spending and buying and cooking in a year from now if we're seeing the forecast recovery in a lot of markets. So looking back, and let's look forward as well. And let's perhaps have a quick countdown, 6 major points which will make up the agenda for agriculture in 2021 and the supply chain going forward. First of all, digital and technology. What are going to be some of the big changes and what are going to be some of the things that companies need to adapt to and utilize going forward? We have seen, whether in my home country of Australia or globally through so many retail chains, a huge growth in online grocery sales. This is likely to continue. Consumers have become accustomed to this. They have changed the way they utilize their time. They've become more comfortable with this. Thus, if you are a processor, if you are a grower, if you are a manufacturer, how do you tailor your product to best suit this and to best suit being sold online, being sold directly, having the commerce channels as well, and to make the most of this as well? Applications across the supply chain are also going to build up the resilience of the supply chain as well to future shocks. Utilizing more technology, what are companies going to seek to do and what will governments seek to do? Provide greater certainty of supply, provide greater certainty of payment. And where this will be important is as we see an increasing amount of investment, I know others are talking about this on this panel today, as we see an increasing amount of investment look more and more to become part of agriculture and the food, beverage and agri supply chain, they will want this certainty. They will want this efficiency of payment. And that's why companies and governments must look to accelerate the digital agenda and utilize these new kinds of technologies as well. It also importantly presents not just opportunities for the major players, the biggest companies to become more efficient, but it also, at the other end of the scale, allows the smaller players new opportunities to enter a global market. We've talked about it before over the years in this industry. We're going to see it ratchet up even further. So if we move from the technology side, what's going to happen on the geopolitical side? Increasingly, and this has happened as part of COVID and as part of the trade dynamics which have been happening around us over the past few weeks, months and years as well, an examination by companies and countries on their concentration risk. Are they over-relying on one market or too few markets for their exports, or relying on too few for their imports as well? Countries at the moment are sorting themselves out domestically, but the rest of this year and 2021 is likely to see a hive of geopolitical activity. It's likely to see countries looking actively to pursue new markets. Importantly, whilst countries pursue new markets for their exports or look to new markets for their imports, they will seek out investment there, they will seek out new kinds of relationship there. But they won't at the same time throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are a lot of very beneficial, long-term, bilateral trade relationships across the agri-supply chain, which would not and should not be sacrificed for the point of some short-term political dynamics, which is something that the world has got used to and needn't be overplayed. This is something that will happen, is in the process of happening, and companies, producers and governments must work together on. If we look at that and look at another political response we're likely to see as part of agriculture and everybody needs to work together on, that's going to be not just diversifying markets in terms of import and export, but building up food security and food manufacture and food processing locally. Expect to see this happening in many countries, whether it's in storage, whether it's in processing, whether it's in production. Once again, arguably this has now been growing for at least the last 15 years as well, but likely to see countries looking towards very strong domestic programs in this, domestic strategies in this. It is imperative that private sector works with government and civil society groups to work on these to make sure that countries can build themselves up to a level of food security as much as is realistic and as much as is possible, that they utilize the opportunities that come out of locally made, locally processed food as well for employment, for social stability, for all parts of society, but at the same time, work out those areas where interaction, relationships, IP with other countries, other companies will continue as well. See that as being a major theme going forward for at least the next 18 months. In terms of sustainability, this will only continue to grow, and it's been talked about importantly, and it will remain a major factor and grow as a major factor for those fundamental reasons that we talk about, that it is the right thing to do to grow sustainability, to grow the environmental, social, and governance themes. Fundamental, of course, but why? To make food more and more of a sustainable, long-term and viable production industry in new countries around the world, in new markets around the world to build those trade relationships. But if we go back to the investment point as well, investment is growing. Investment will grow at even faster rates into agriculture, into food. But it needs to see these ESG themes. It needs to see this sustainability for regulatory reasons, for shareholder reasons, and for simple investment return reasons as well, a big factor going forward. And in the final 2 points in terms of the vision, what are we also likely to see? As a result of what's happened over the past few months with COVID, going forward, we will see a big wave of corporate activity, of M&A, of horizontal integration, of vertical integration as countries and companies look for efficiency. And companies must be ready to make the most of this and use this as an opportunity. And finally, what's been a big change, and that has been the consumer. In whichever country you are in whichever country you are dealing with, the consumer will go back to some of their ways, but other ways will change permanently. What they buy, what they eat, what they cook, what their children eat and cook, and will change in the long term. Why they do it, why they choose it. Whether it's at home, whether it's changes in tourism, whether it's changes in their income impacting what they buy. All of these things are part of the vision going forward, for which companies must adapt, and which the companies that we all deal with and the governments we deal with are quite capable of adapting and making the most of. So there's some of the major things which will come not just out of COVID, but out of an increasingly sophisticated and increasingly viable and fundamental food, beverage, and agricultural supply chain. Looking forward, all companies are in a position where they will have challenges and things could get tougher through a global recessionary period going forward. But the need for food will remain strong, the need for feed will remain strong, the need for fuels and fibers will remain strong as well. It's up to companies to make the most of these opportunities and to build for a great future. Thank you for your listening time today, and I look forward to questions on the panel going forward. Thank you.